Hi, folks. Rob Goller here. Thank you for joining me for another week of local history. This week's topic came about from some comments that were made on some social media posts, some of the local history related groups. And I tend not to have time, or I just physically don't see all the posts that come up. And sometimes I'll be tagged, or someone will send me a message with a question. But a lot of times it's not that I'm ignoring them, I just don't see many of the discussion and the comments that happen on some of those social media pages. But this one actually did, and there was actually a couple instances where someone was asking a question or talking about an event that happened in the past, and it actually related to when a local business was in business or when it closed. And a couple people swore that the business had gone under, or actually they didn't go under. The people retired, so they were a successful business up until they decided to retire. And they swore that this business had the folks who had owned it retired in the 1980s, and that didn't sound right to me. But I thought, oh, I thought it was in the 1990s when I was in high school. I remember the business still being in business, and I do remember the owners retiring in the 1990s. So they were swearing, that they recalled that the business was still that had gone out of business by the 1980s. I was thinking, oh no, it's definitely later, because I remember in high school. Well, then I actually looked it up, and I went down this rabbit hole of looking up the date of this business, um, and I used phone directories that we have and in the archives at the town and in the town historian's office, as well as some newspaper articles. And it turns out the business was still going in the early 2000s. So we both were way off. The folks that were on the social media commenting about when they what their memory was telling them about when this business was still going strong, and my recollection as in response to their recollection, and it turns out our memory was terrible. We didn't remember it correctly, and when you actually looked it up, it wasn't neither one of us were accurate. So I've talked about this before about the idea of nostalgia, how in the past we have this idea that the past was better, the good old days, correct? Well, even more specifically, our recollection of dates and when things happen are often inaccurate. Our memories, whether we are old, young, in between, are just terrible barometers at determining when things happened. Um, Time is a weird thing, right? And we forget that when things happen and putting things in relation to other events in our lives. So that was a perfect example where we were so way off on this event in our community, and we were commenting it on back and forth on social media. So I thought that was quite interesting, trying to figure out how good our memories were, and it turns out not good at all. This happened also recently. Someone was talking to me about Tops, the supermarket, and a lot of us remember it on Main Street, where the Rite Aid Plaza is today. And we were having a conversation about it and talking about it, and somehow the conversation placed the Tops on Main Street much more recent than it actually was there. In fact, Tops moved to the new plaza, the new Tops moved to the old plaza on Gray Street in the early 2000s, more than 20 years ago. We're going on to 25 years ago now. And it seems just yesterday how that it was on Main Street. So if we were going off our recollection of when Tops was on Main Street, it might not be accurate. So the lesson is to look things up, because our memories are terrible at remembering exact dates and when things happen and putting them in a timeline. And things often happen in a different way than we remember them. So oftentimes I'll read in a history book where someone's is using as a source someone's memory, and I'm like, oh, if you can get a primary source for something, it's much more accurate usually. This is why I like diaries and journals and newspapers. Newspapers are extremely important. Minutes from village town board meetings, primary sources that we can go back to. Um, and journals and diaries are extremely helpful even to ourselves, because sometimes we look back on something and we look back on it in a different way than we actually experienced it. And it's very helpful to go back to the journal and the diary and say, oh, yeah, that's where my head was at that moment. That's what was happening at that moment, helping you put in things into context. Perfect example is COVID. I don't know how many times I've been having conversations recently where we talk about COVID, and we kind of forget how bad it was, how our lives were disrupted. We're 4 years out of it, a little more than 4 years out of it from the beginning of it, and we seem to have forgotten how locked down we were, the impact on local businesses and our daily lives. And we forget. And if we could go back to a journal or newspaper reports, photographs, the actual documentation, rather than our memory of it, it's much more accurate. We just tend to look back at things in the past in a different way than what it was like when we were actually living through it. I've talked to people when we're talking about COVID, we're forgetting really what it was like when we were in the midst of COVID. This just doesn't happen with local history, and one of the things that gave me the idea for today is the idea of looking at the past differently. And one of them is there was this poll that came out, and they were talking about job approval ratings. We talked about the presidential election, and one of the things that popped out to me, and whether you voted for Trump or Kamala Harris, it doesn't really matter because this could go either way. But what they had noticed in this newspaper article, and they had pointed out, was that a Gallup poll for job approval ratings noted that Donald Trump's approval rating when he was leaving office the first time in 2021 was at 34%, very low. This was after January 6th, and it was a very low job approval rating for Donald Trump. Now, fast forward about 4 years, a little less than 4 years, a couple weeks ago, as the election an election campaign is in full swing, and Gallup did a survey, a poll, and asked the same question, but they asked it as what is your recollection of the job approval? How good of a job was President Trump doing, or did he do? And the job approval rating was 48%. So whether you agree with Trump or not, the job approval rating at the time of his presidency was 34%, and same people essentially looking back, America looking back at his presidency, gave him a 48% job approval rating. So it jumped 14% just with time. So what changed? Well, people's recollection of the events were different than their actual at the time living through it. Now, the reason some of this might happen is we've had more life experience, so we have more things perhaps to compare it to, but also our recollection of events is just different. We have a much different perspective looking back on something as we do when we're living in the middle of it. And that's one of the perfect examples I see is even if you agree with Trump today or not, at the time, only 34% said he was doing a good job. And then somehow, when people are asked the same question, looking back on it, more people have a more positive reaction to that question or his job approval, the job he did as president. Much higher number, if you believe the numbers, but then that number drastically changed in retrospect. Quite interesting. So again, another reason to focus on research and looking things up. It's sometimes simple to do. For instance, when a business closed, you swear something happened, and we often mix things up. We forget someone recently was talking about the Seaman Hood and Maury store, and I'm going back a little bit, so if some of you don't remember it here in East Aurora, Seaman Hood and Maury store being at the plaza at the Aurora Village Shopping Center down at Gray Street. I don't know, that was never there. Seaman Hood and Maury was never at the plaza. Well, what turned out was that Seaman Hood and Maury was up at the other end of town, up by across from the Masonic Temple, near Riley and Elm Street there. Uh, and Seaman Hood and Maury, it was a department store that was around for a very long time. That's a story in itself. But it sold out to Buffalo department stores eventually and became the Sample. And then the Sample had moved to the Plaza, but people mixed it up. In their head, they had Seaman Hood and Maury down at the Plaza. So one of the things that happened when I was appointed historian eons ago, 17 years ago, is I was in my early 30s, and at the time I thought I'm too young to be a historian. I don't have the memories. I haven't lived long enough to know what happened. And a lot of times people see historians as older folks who have memories of things. But over time, I've realized it's actually better to be younger and not have those memories, because I have to look a lot up, and a lot of younger people too, when they're doing research, they have to look it up because they don't have that memory of it. And in some instances, that's a good thing because you're confirming the events and the dates rather than relying on your memory, which is often wrong. So I actually welcome that lack of knowledge. As a lot of people sometimes ask me questions, I'm like, no, I have to look it up because I'm not going to rely on my memory of it. And I do look it up. I try to do the best I can to find the information, but I don't pretend to know the answer, because even if I do have an inkling that I do know the answer, I'm often wrong because my memory is very bad at that. And a lot of the information I do know is based off research and finding documents, not my own memory of it. Because, like I said, it feels like yesterday that Tops Supermarket was on Main Street. It feels like yesterday that some of these businesses were around when in fact that they, you know, closed a long, long time ago. Our perception of time is way off when it comes to our memories of it. So we have to keep that in mind when we're looking back at history, and not be too hard on ourselves that we don't remember things. We got a lot of information going on in our heads. So look it up. Look up the answers if it's that important to you to know the answer. Don't rely on your memory. A lot of times I'll see on social media people will post things as fact from their memories, and it turns out not to be true. And I'm just as guilty of that as anyone. So keep that in mind. Why is this important? Well, because if you're really studying history, to put things in perspective, having the timing of events and the accuracy of events is important when you're trying to put things in perspective. If we're placing a certain event from our memory in World War II or at a different time period when it didn't actually happen, it could really mess up how we put historical things in context. And plus, it's just great to have the correct information, and not knowing where to go look to find that correct information. So long story short, don't rely on your memory to tell you for historical information if possible. This is not to say that discount oral histories. Oral histories are hugely important. Stories that are passed from one generation to another, especially oral histories that were passed down before we had newspapers and documents. And of course, doing oral history projects today is really important to hear people's stories, their remembrances. But it's only one. I've heard a lot of oral histories here in East Aurora. There was a project years ago, and we're actually thinking of doing a new one, of oral histories. And I was listening to the stories, and some of the things were wrong. Some of the things that were mentioned were incorrect. But it gets you in the right direction. It gets people thinking about it. There was one gentleman who talked about stores on Main Street, and he got dates and times mixed up. But it's a good step to get the proper information, to get the correct information. And people's memories are important, but it's one piece of the puzzle when we're looking back on on history. And we always talk about, when I was in school, having three sources, and also in journalism, having three sources. Trying to find more sources. Don't rely on oral histories or your memory as the only source. Check out phone directories, newspaper articles, primary sources in the past to validate, to verify the information that you are remembering. And sometimes you might be right, and sometimes you might be wrong. Part of the fun of research and local history. Again, thank you for joining me for this weekly chat. I am Robert Lowell Goller. I am the Town and Village Historian, but these videos and a lot of the research that I do are not officially affiliated with my duties as Town and Village Historian. Thanks as always for keeping the comments coming and the questions. Some of these ideas, many of these ideas come from you. So pop them in the comments or send me a private message. As always, thank you for keeping history alive, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.